Thank you, Sondos, and thank you for the invitation to come and be part of this gathering today. I'm going to talk about something which I think is important to anybody who works in the wild, and that's what I and my colleagues have been doing for the last 15 years, and I imagine that people here at ADFA, University of New South Wales, are working in the wild as well. You really care about how the things you do actually work in practice in the field, and where you can't sit back and build complex models which will help you understand the situations better. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about a process that we've been developing, which we call collaborative conceptual modelling, and an issue that has arisen in that, which is the issue of can you use small, what I think that you could call core models. The Shane's introductory talk really is a very good introduction to what I want to talk about. Captures a lot of the issues of understanding complex systems and the critical role that mental models play in our decision making. Now, CCM is a name we've given to a process that we have developed which consists of 6 co-evolving activities. They're co-evolving in the sense that you do some work on one of them, you come back and you revisit it later as you've learnt more about what's going on. These activities are introduced with lead questions. So you bring together a multidisciplinary group and you say, what are the challenges? Plural. It's not what is the challenge. Too often people begin work on a problem by saying, what's the problem? Let's get in and solve it. And they do that before they know each other, before they understand how each other thinks, and before they've explored the problem to any extent at all. And that, of course, then means they're often locked into a process which leads to a dead end. The area we've been working in is urban health, particularly, and in Southeast Asian cities. So we are typically working with a wide range of people, a wide range of disciplines, experience, and allegiances. And so our challenge has been how to help these people come to terms with situations, the decision-making situations, where all of their perspectives are critical, where they don't understand each other, and where we have a reasonably limited time with them, maybe, if we're lucky, 2 days. So what do you do in those circumstances to help people make a significant improvement in their understanding? There's a burden of education. They don't know even the simplest of system dynamics concepts. Many of them don't know, well, they hear the word feedback and they think this is what your boss gives you when you go into the office and he tells you you're fired. They have many challenges. And our focus then has to have been on challenging their mental models, helping them make better decisions. So the first thing is, what are the challenges? Then what are the stories? An activity where we get them to think about how things have changed over time. This is the historical dimension of the study. And can they capture the way things have changed in influence diagrams or causal-lift diagrams? About as far as we can go into standard system dynamics tools is to use diagrams like that, which we train them a little bit about how to use those diagrams. We talk to them a lot about how to express variables properly. And then we get them individually to capture the stories as influence diagrams. We present influence diagrams as story generators, because once you've developed the diagram, someone who knows how to read it can actually regenerate the story, starting anywhere in the diagram. then can I see how you think? Now, a lot of what we do involves standard system dynamics processes, but we also have specific protocols we've developed. One of them we call pair blending. We get people who individually set up an influence diagram capturing their mental model of how cause and effect work in the thing that they're concerned about. Then we ask them to work in pairs and put their diagrams together. And very often they'll say, oh, we can't do that. Our diagrams are too different. We're on about completely different issues. 15 minutes later, because they can read each other's diagram, because they can actually see visually how each other's thinking about cause and effect, about the issue they're thinking of. They can see a connection, they find connections. And we keep saying, keep the number of variables down. We're after that core understanding. Can you decide what's the most important thing? What drives system behaviour? That's where we start introducing simple models, simple dynamical models that illustrate certain key system dynamic ideas. And they start looking at, are there some feedback loops here that might be driving what's going on? Where are the leverage points? And those of you that know system dynamics well will know, for example, of Meadows' leverage point list, which is reasonably useful. What are the challenges? What futures can we see? And that's basically involves some scenario modelling. I don't want to talk about this in any detail today, but I want to go on to this issue of decomposability of complex systems. A lot of people who approach the study of complex systems have a strong belief in what we call the complexity dilemma. So a complex system, a complex adaptive system, is a set of parts or elements that interact with each other, and the behaviour of that system emerges from the interactions between those parts. If you take the system apart, it simply disappears. So you can't understand the behaviour of a complex system by studying the parts separately, but when you try to study the system as a whole, you are overwhelmed by its complexity. And really complex diagrams can put a lot of people off, as we heard before. So the dilemma is you can't understand it. You're damned if you don't, you're damned if you do. And that leads you to think that there are only two possibilities, and they're mutually exclusive. Either you study isolated parts, which may be subsystems, or you study the whole system. And the fact that people think like this is made very apparent by the ubiquity of silo management. Very often, management breaks up into, governance breaks up into focus on fairly small areas. I mean, we have a transport problem, or we have a nutrition problem, or we have a sewage problem. And people don't see that wider system. And they're happy, and of course, the existence of those silos represents a reality, excuse me, a reality that human beings do need to have a simpler view of the whole system. It really is hard to think of the whole thing at any one time. So that this has led us to question that are there systems, are there situations where you can study the dynamics of isolated subsystems but still grasp the behaviour of the wider system? Now, some clues to whether you can understand a complex system in terms of a simpler core problem or a simpler core feedback structure come from a number of things. The Resilience Alliance has done a lot of work over the last 20 years on the behaviour of complex ecological systems. And what they have discovered is something they call the rule of hand. At any one scale, if you look at a complex system, ecological system, you find you can describe its behaviour with a feedback system that has no more than about 5 variables in it. And that's a clue. The existence existence of these system archetypes is another clue. You have generic structures that actually can explain behaviour in a wide range of situations. They're quite generic. There's a danger in using them, as Sturman's pointed out, but there are cases where when you're working with somebody who doesn't know about systems, if you can get them to understand one of the archetypes in the context of their concerns, that may represent a huge step forward in their understanding, in their mental models. Another indication, and of course we've got Justin's statement this morning that often you come down to what really matters in changing a person's mental model is an understanding of some core structure that can presumably be quite simple. Simple in terms of number of variables, but dynamically complex. So Herbert Simon captured my attention in the Sciences of the Artificial. He talks about systems that are near decomposable. And he claims that hierarchies are, and some systems are hierarchical. And I've tended not to think of hierarchies as being feedback systems, but it got me thinking. So he defines a near decomposable system. One is one where the interaction between the subsystems are weaker than the interactions within the subsystems. The subsystems are tightly bound, and the broader system is less tightly bound. And he comes up with two propositions. One, that in the short run, the subsystems behave more or less independently. And in the long run, the behaviour of any one subsystem depends in only an aggregate way on the behaviour of the other subsystems. And that sounds like a lot of things that we've seen in the wild. So he goes on to say, these facts have the effect of separating the high-frequency dynamics of a hierarchy involving the internal structure of the subsystems from the low-frequency dynamics involving interactions among the subsystems. So one of the protocols we've been playing with, and this is reasonably recent, the last year or two, is a thing, for want of a better name, we call feedback-guided analysis. It's a CCM protocol, and it provides a disciplined way to develop computable models with well-defined state variables and state change processes that maintain the overall feedback structure of the wider system, or at least remain connected to the wider structure. And we began to realise that the FGA protocol leads to a set of subroutines which you could consider to be a near decomposable hierarchy. So let's have a look how it works. So in panel A, the circle represents the whole system, whole complex system, and the dots represent state variables. And of course, in a real complex system, there are going to be thousands or even tens of thousands of variables if you look at different ways and different scales. So the first step in feedback-guided analysis is to say, what subsystems are we going to consider as fundamental in our context, in the problems we're trying to work on? What is the fundamental makeup of this overall complex system? So the red circles there represent subsystems which focus attention on a subset of the variables, and the arrows represent the influence links between those. And of course, it can be more complex than that. So the system overview template then is a specification of how we're going to regard this complex system as being made up at the highest possible level. Then the next step is to produce a problem space which narrows your focus even more. So you're focusing tighter on the variables. You've now picked out a subset of variables within each of those original subsystems. But you've still got the same feedback connections between them. And then the final step is to go what we've been calling specific system of interest, which can maybe have even only one variable in one of the problem space systems. So it's a process of, you could call it holistic reduction if you like. You're narrowing down your focus becoming more and more specific about your variables, which means you're getting closer and closer to be able to build a computable model. But at the same time, you're keeping aware of and allowing for the influence of those lower frequency connections between the subsystems. And we have found this actually works reasonably well with a multidisciplinary group. People get it, and it does seem to work. So a given overview template can produce a number of problem space diagrams, and a given problem space diagram can be expanded or focused down into a number of specific systems of interest. So the overview template is a high-level diagram that tells how you want to decompose the system into major subsystems and preserves the dominant causal links that operate between those subsystems. And the overview template should be as generic as possible, and to make it work properly in real life, it must be scalable. So here's an example. The template specifies 4 main subsystems in the area we've been working in, focused on planetary health. Planetary health is a newly emerging field in urban health, or human health and well-being. It focuses on the interaction between human beings and the planet, looking at the health of the ecosystems and the health of people. So this overview template specifies a decomposition into those 4 subsystems: state of the worldviews, state of policy, state of human health and well-being, and state of the environment are the variables which are aggregate state variables. And of course, you can see the connection between the discussion this morning about mental models and worldviews. The only difference here is that we put policies, which are the goals and decision rules. In this case, we separate them out from the worldviews. Scalable template subsystems must be able to be scaled independently. So a single template can guide discussion of large-scale problems like global climate change, small-scale problems like an individual's efforts to remain healthy, and cross-scale problems, the impact of climate change on an individual's health, for example. I just want to go through this to make it clear how we would explain this to somebody in a group, people in a group. And for this discussion, we'll take the worldview of an individual or society to be an interrelated, comprehensive set of variables that reflects assumptions about how the world works. These variables measure the state of the community's knowledge, understanding, their mental models, their formal models, and their assumptions or theories about cause and effect. It includes variables that represent the state of community beliefs, their values and ethics. We take the policies of an individual or society to be a comprehensive set of rules that govern behaviour, the focus and power of formal laws, institutions and regulations. So these policies are the ones that guide actions and goals and sets of decision rules. And some of the rules are followed or enforced consciously, and others are just seen as just common sense. The environment subsystem, in the work we've been doing, we take those variables to measure the state of both ecosystems and the built environment. When we're dealing with individuals or small groups of people, we will assume that their environment also includes other people. The variables include those related to the nature and extent of physical infrastructure, the prevalence of devices such as motor vehicles, television sets, cell phones, air conditioners, and the Internet of Things. And the health and wellbeing subsystem, as you might imagine, encompasses all the relevant physiological and psychological variables, plus wellbeing variables such as security, comfort, and happiness. The arrows, we're fairly strict about how we get people to think about influence diagrams. And we say the arrows, the actions are in the arrows. So the processes and mechanisms by which one variable affects another are in the influence links. And so policy making, link one is policy making, planning, policy design and goal setting activities that are shaped by the community's worldviews, come out of their mental models, their understanding. Links 2, 4 and 6 are learning links. The system is going to be adaptive. There has to be learning from experience in there, learning from history, observations and assessment of the state of policy subsystem, and feedback of insights that can affect the state of the community's worldviews. Link 3, human actions, individual and group activities that affect the community's overall physiological, psychological and social functioning. 4, again, experiential learning, observation and assessment of the evolution of population health and well-being. 5, human actions again that affect the environment. 6, another learning link, observation and assessment of the state of evolution of the environment. And again, these monitoring activities can lead to modification of community worldviews. And 7, co-effects. Now, co-effects are the effects where changes in the environment directly affect human health and well-being without human intervention. So, just give you an example of work that was done in a workshop on urbanism, climate change and health. And this workshop was run in Asia with a group of about 30 people from a whole bunch of different backgrounds. And this was the overview template that the group produced after an initial World Cafe event and looking at what the challenges might be. So they had the state of the environment, population health and well-being, and the state of the urban complex. Now that template can be converted into technology problem space. So one of the issues that they were focusing on was the impact of technology. And a lot of our adoption of technologies is maladaptive. So the worldview variable is built into the state of urban complex in this case. The extent to which community depends on specific technologies, and then there are the urban decision makers' level of concern for future health outcomes and their concern for future environmental outcomes. And they're driven by the extent to which urban policy and planning is integrative and the extent to which health sector takes a proactive approach. And then I just want to show you two specific systems of interest that came from that workshop. One about health and one about transport and one about health. So the level of dependence on private motor vehicles drives local air quality. It also, with a long time delay, drives the level of climate variables that adversely affect local air quality. That affects cardiovascular health and respiratory health. And there is a link between the extent and quality of public transport network and active travel infrastructure and the level of dependence on private motor vehicles. Now, these are all fairly obvious sitting here now, but they represented a real revelation as far as the group we were working with were concerned. And they were very excited about the shared view of dynamics that they were getting from this. And then the refrigerated air conditioning subsystem, the dependence, the growing dependence on refrigerated air conditioning around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, is really maladaptive. There's a whole range of reasons why it carries increased risk of thermal stress. So here, what they came up with was that the level of dependence on refrigerated air conditioning affected maximum urban ambient temperatures by the heat island effect and the heat canyon effect. It also, of course, affected climate variability via CO2 emissions from power generation and escape of refrigerants. Affects the peak load on the electricity system, which increases the chances of power supply failure. Level of acclimatisation of people to local temperature regimes. People who live and work and travel in air-conditioned comfort then physiologically lose the ability to adapt to temperature changes. That means if there is a failure of power, then they're exposed to temperature regimes that they cannot handle. And it also, of course, the level of dependence on air conditioning reduces the dependence on passive indoor climate control. So it's very much cheaper to build a house that's air conditioned and one that's well insulated and has a whole range of passive climate control measures. And food security. So the same sort of thing, level of dependence on inland irrigated agriculture changes the vulnerability of food production to climate change, affects the extent of urban agriculture, and all those affect food security. Now, the thing we've learned from this exercise is that it is possible to take a group of people with wide background, people who don't know each other, who don't know each other in a disciplinary sense either, whose mental models are extremely difficult, are different and difficult sometimes, whose metaphorical understanding of fundamental concepts is strikingly different. And in a matter of a couple of days of working with them, to actually get them to start to see why feedback might matter and how feedback probably is the thing that connects their different disciplines together. So we're in the process of trying to investigate some of this further. And the reason I wanted to talk about it today is that it's a tricky thing to think about, the issue of to what extent can you represent the basic behaviour or the most important or the dominant behaviour of a complex system with a relatively simple model and that captures perhaps 4 or 5 primary variables and the feedback interactions between them that give rise to dynamic complexity. Thank you.
The initial stages where you talk about telling the stories and some of those more qualitative steps, is that just to warm participants up so they can draw a more accurate CLD when we get down to the more?
No, it's a fundamental process in getting the group to start expressing their mental models in a visible form. And what we've found, and I'd be interested in other people's comments about this, is that if we can train people to do influence diagrams, not worrying about polarities on the influence links for the moment, they can actually express their mental models of cause and effect in a fairly satisfactory way from their point of view. And the person sitting next to them can do the same. They're capturing something that they believe is how the world works, and they'll be different. And if person A does the same thing tomorrow, they'll do a different diagram probably as a result of conversations they've had today. So we stress the fact that these models, these diagrams are ephemeral in one sense, but they're fundamentally important in another. They really are expressions of their mental models. You've got a group of people who can read those diagrams the way they're intended and the variables are well expressed, then you can have a really rich discussion in a multidisciplinary group. What do you mean by that variable? Why do you have that link there? I don't see how that works at all. And people have got a medium within which they can have a rich, productive discussion about how the system they're dealing with works.
Is there a traceability back once you've got a CLD to say, right, how does this account for Bill's statement here, reference this particular situation? Is that accounted for in the variables and the actions? Is that sort of how the process works?
Yeah, we can certainly have discussions like that. Typically we're working with fairly short timescales and people go away really enthusiastic and they're going to change the world. And some of those people get back to us and we take the conversation further. So one of our concerns is you really can help people. That we've discovered you really can help people see something of what's going on or think differently about what's going on. But then it's really hard to take that further and do something where they can start using systems thinking and modelling to actually make better decisions. But we figure that there are so many cases and so many situations around the world where access the modelling facilities, even in the present days, are limited. So the access to experienced and competent modellers is limited. And if we can just get people to start thinking, well, maybe there's a different way to see these things, that's a reasonable contribution. It's a problem. I mean, we often have, depends on who you're working with. If you're working with a group of postgraduate students, it's one thing. If you're working with a group of really experienced pain researchers, all of whom got their different view of what's going on, and some of their patients, it's a very different context because you've got people there who are really expert in their areas. And you'll find people saying, gee, I've just changed the way I've been thinking for the last 30 years.
With the pair blending process, does it always come out to an amicable, nice joint diagram, or do people still continue to have two different worldviews?
Usually, I say 90% of the cases, people come up with something which is a genuine linking of their thinking. And depends on how good they are at how good they are at logical thinking, analytic thinking, but also how open they are to changing their ideas, of course. Usually, though, the people we're working with have self-selected into these workshops, and so mostly they're pretty open. We have occasional, not quite heated exchanges, but certainly vigorous exchanges, and they're the best, of course. And one of the things we stress is we do not want people to lose their individual perspectives. We want them to see, not to blend them and to end up with a mush of blended ideas. The power in a multidisciplinary groups comes from the different perspectives. You've got to somehow see how do these contribute separately but together to a better understanding and to better mental models of what's going on.
Questions? So I actually have a question, Mary. I'm wondering if you have already done this and collect some data on what actually changed the company. You said that you don't want them to have the individual perspective, the same context. How will you measure this, capture this in a way that you can convince people that the process works?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've not written a lot of this up because we've been working in the wild for a long time, trying to understand ourselves what's going on. But we're now about to enter a phase where we'll do precisely that. It's difficult to determine the state of someone's mental models, but we have visual representation of them from this process. We have a huge stack of sketch diagrams in our back pocket, and we're starting to look at those and to see what they tell us about the way people's thinking has evolved, particularly from the two individual diagrams to the blended diagram. Because there's a short-term thing, something's happened then. Usually we then ask people to present those diagrams, talk about the process they went through and what new insights they've got. And we haven't recorded much of that. And often we're working in situations where to have that kind of research level over the top of the workshop wouldn't work very well. Some of these groups are, there are people who are not well educated and who feel a bit intimidated by some of the people present, so we try not to make it sound too formal. But no, good question. Get back to us in a year's time.